I was in an office in Tokyo a few months back. A colleague's phone rang, and you would have thought a bomb went off, seriously.
Well,
He looked genuinely horrified, apologized to the room, grabbed his phone, and physically ran out of the open plan space to take the call in the hallway.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just understood. You do not impose your private life on the group. You don't break the harmony. It's this invisible rule, but it's absolute.
the sense of wow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then, 2 weeks later, I was on a train in my home city, London. In my carriage, a man was watching a football match on his phone, speaker on full blast.
Oh, dear.
Across from him, a woman was on a loud FaceTime call. 2 seats down, someone else was listening to music. You know, that tiny, tinny sound leaking from their headphones for everyone to hear.
The classic commute soundtrack.
Right. Nobody said anything, of course. Everyone just endured it. They retreated deeper into their own private worlds, sharing a space, but definitely not a set of rules. And in that moment, the contrast just hit me like a physical force. Tokyo, a society bound by this powerful, unspoken civic script. London, a society of, well, disconnected individuals, each living by their own rules.
It's a stark difference.
It really is, and it forced me to re-examine an assumption I had held my entire life as a liberal Brit. What if pluralism isn't enough? What if a state, to actually function, needs something more? That something more is the idea we're exploring today. The necessity, perhaps, of a civic monoculture.
It's civic monoculture,
Yeah.
yeah. A foundation of shared public values strong enough to bind deep diversity into genuine cohesion.
It's a provocative concept, isn't it? Especially when we're so conditioned to believe that maximum diversity automatically yields maximum stability.
It absolutely is provocative. And what's fascinating here is that this idea that a required unifying public ethos is critical for state function is the core challenge we're analyzing today. We're diving deep into the policy and conceptual frameworks that define this need.
And we're doing that by comparing two really different paths.
Exactly. We're specifically comparing the contrasting trajectories of Japan and the UK. Japan prioritized cohesion through, well, cultural containment, resisting change for a long time.
Whereas the UK enthusiastically embraced diversity.
But now struggles dramatically with unity. It's a fascinating comparison.
This deep dive is our shortcut, really, to understanding the policy frameworks and societal mechanisms needed to cultivate this civic monoculture in diverse liberal democracies.
And it's not just academic theory.
No, definitely not. It's about the visible differences in social life, like my two train stories, and the profound policy challenges faced by two major global economies. Both are grappling simultaneously with immigration, identity, and these crippling demographic pressures.
We're looking for the policy decisions, the underlying choices that determine whether your society looks more like that quiet Tokyo office.
Or that cacophonous London train.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack the UK first, because historically, policy-wise, it positioned itself as the polar opposite of Japan's containment model, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The UK, as an established liberal democracy, really leaned into immigration and diversity in the post-war era. It wasn't passive. It actively institutionalized that approach through multiculturalism.
And why was that? What were the drivers?
Well, it was a conscious choice driven by dual needs, really. Post-war Britain desperately needed labor, especially from its former empire, the Commonwealth, to rebuild its economy. That was the practical side.
Right, the economic necessity.
But simultaneously, it was a political and moral project. It was about projecting a modern, inclusive, post-imperial national identity globally. This wasn't just about tolerance. It became official state policy.
And this commitment was actually written into law, wasn't it? It provided the legal scaffolding for this new identity. We're talking about major pieces of legislation.
Indeed. Cornerstones like the 1948 British Nationality Act. That was huge.
How so?
Well, the 1948 Act established the principle of citizenship for all subjects of the Commonwealth, essentially inviting migration. And later policies, like the 2010 Equality Act, went further.
Further in what way?
They institutionalized multiculturalism not just as tolerance, but as active encouragement for minority communities to maintain distinct customs, languages, and faiths. The policy essentially created space for deep cultural pluralism by design.
And the assumption was?
The assumption was that the shared legal system, the rule of law, would be enough glue to hold everything together.
But our sources suggest that this kind of pluralism, maybe when it wasn't underpinned by a really robust shared civic foundation, began to show severe strain, particularly visible by the early 2000s, right?
That's where things started to fray, yes.
Yeah.
Now, where did the cohesion break down? It seems it broke down when difference became segmentation.
Segmentation.
Yes, sociological data began revealing that populations were segmenting not just by predictable markers like class or geography, but critically by core values and worldviews. People were living side by side.
But in different moral universes, almost.
Exactly, holding fundamentally different definitions of public morality and social obligations.
And this brings us to that really powerful concept you mentioned earlier, intranational civilizational pluralism.
That phrase really captures the central dilemma facing the UK today.
It's about having multiple communities, each shaped by distinct historical and religious traditions, coexisting under one shared legal framework.
Yet frequently pulling in opposing moral, educational, or social directions. It creates real friction.
Okay, let's make this concrete. You mentioned a library debate earlier. That seems like a perfect illustration of this tension playing out, on the ground.
It really is. To move this from the abstract to the tangible, that library debate is spot on.
So imagine a local council meeting, maybe in a diverse city like Birmingham, debating library rules. The tension wasn't theoretical, was it? It was about the lived function of a public space.
Precisely. The conflict wasn't about funding the library, but about defining the civic norms within it. What rules should govern this shared space?
And you had different groups with very different ideas.
Exactly. One group, rooted in specific religious and cultural traditions, argued for things like distinct prayer sections. And critically, they requested separate gender reading times to preserve cultural modesty and hierarchy. They were seeking respect for their distinct norms within the public sphere.
Okay, so they wanted the public space to accommodate their specific values.
Yes. But the opposing group demanded a completely different vision of the public good.
Which was?
They demanded that the library must remain a totally neutral shared space, organized solely by subject, accessible to everyone equally, reflecting secular civic norms where shared, universally applied rules must override specific group demands.
Wow. That's a fundamental clash over the nature of public space.
In this scenario, you see it repeated across schools, housing councils, public services. It demonstrates the messy, constant negotiation over public space and fundamental norms when there isn't a strong, agreed-upon civic script.
What stands out from the analysis is that the state, because it was so committed to protecting difference, became sort of paralyzed when it came to demanding coherence. Why did liberal multiculturalism struggle so much to articulate that shared civic language?
Well, the policy failure was multifaceted, it seems. Firstly, there was this assumption, which turned out to be wrong, that legal rights, just protecting difference, would automatically yield social cohesion.
Just granting rights isn't enough to build community.
Apparently not. And secondly, the state hesitated to demand coherence. There was often a deep-seated fear, a real political sensitivity, about being labeled racist or discriminatory.
So setting boundaries on cultural practice, even in the name of a shared civic norm, became politically toxic.
Extremely toxic. So by protecting difference maximally, they avoided articulating and enforcing a unifying national identity. And the perception grew, rightly or wrongly, that the state's commitment to pluralism came at the expense of that unifying force.
And that perception, that feeling, surely brings us right into the political landscape that fostered the Brexit vote.
Absolutely.
The referendum was about much more than just economics and the EU, wasn't it? It was heavily influenced by these deep-seated anxieties over identity and pluralism.
The source material makes that very clear. Conflicts over multiculturalism and the perceived fragmentation of national identity were critical drivers for the Leave vote. You could see it in public discourse.
How so?
Well, concerns about multiculturalism, security, and immigration were deliberately and, frankly, effectively conflated. People often point to things like UKIP's notorious campaign posters.
Right.
But the underlying success of that kind of messaging rested on a pre-existing anxiety, a feeling about loss of control and a loss of cultural coherence.
So the anxiety wasn't just about the number of immigrants, perhaps, but about the type of society the UK was becoming. Was that the fear?
That's the crucial distinction, I think. For many citizens, particularly those who felt economically marginalized, the post-war social contract, the economic and social rights granted by British citizenship, they felt those were being steadily eroded.
And immigration became linked to that feeling of erosion.
It did. This anxiety was compounded by this powerful narrative that the welfare state, once a symbol of shared British endeavor, was now under threat because of the volume of migration. Now, whether that's economically accurate is complex.
But the belief was powerful.
The belief was incredibly powerful, irrespective of complex economic data on immigrant contributions. It galvanized significant support for leave. Essentially, the UK failed to create or maintain a civic monoculture robust enough to assure its citizens that while diversity was protected, the fundamental unspoken public rulers, the rules of the London train, if you like, were still understood and perhaps enforced. Okay, so if the UK is the exemplar of liberal pluralism struggling with fragmentation, Japan offers the historical counterpoint. It's a model really defined by cohesion through containment.
Containment. That sounds quite restrictive.
It has been. Japan tends to view itself not merely as a modern political state, but as a civilizational entity, defined by a singular, unique cultural logic and a profound ethos of social harmony. That concept of wa.
Wa. That's what I felt in that Tokyo office, right? That absolute unspoken expectation of prioritizing group harmony over individual desire. It's almost a sacred cultural imperative, not just a preference.
It really is deeply ingrained. And how does that translate into the state's approach to outsiders? Well, it translates into a strong, historically rooted impulse to manage, restrict, and often outright contain foreign presence.
Where does that come from historically?
You can trace this instinct back centuries, most famously to the self-isolationist policy of Sakoku, the closed country policy enforced from the 17th to the 19th century.
2 whole centuries of sealed borders.
Pretty much. It was a deliberate, long-term attempt to preserve political and cultural homogeneity. And this historical precedent absolutely shapes modern policy. Belonging in Japan has traditionally required not just legal compliance, but intense ethnic and cultural fluency.
So being Japanese is more than just having a passport.
Much more. Foreign presence has long been tolerated only if it remains quiet, restrained, and non-disruptive, essentially absorbed fully into the dominant cultural pattern. Don't rock the boat.
And for decades, this resulted in an official policy mantra that effectively maintained a historical deadlock on immigration, didn't it?
Precisely. For decades, the conservative establishment maintained that Japan would only accept highly qualified, highly skilled foreign workers. That was the official line.
But you mentioned a gap between policy and reality.
A massive gap. Reality directly contradicted policy. The sources show that prior to the big 2018 reforms, nearly 0% of foreign labor already working in Japan did not meet those official high-skill requirements.
80%. So how are they getting in?
They entered through various side doors, as the analysts call them. Things like student visas, trainee programs, or other loopholes that existed only because the economy desperately needed the labor, even if politicians wouldn't admit it.
So Japan knew it needed the labor, but was politically unwilling to openly accept it. That led to 50 years of, well, policy standstill.
A persistent standstill. And the sources argue this whole debate was structured around 4 competing policy frames that constantly battled each other. Understanding these frames helps explain why progress was so slow.
Okay, what were these 4 frames?
The first frame, and perhaps the most emotionally potent, was national identity and cultural self-definition. This centers on the concept of ethnic homogeneity, Tenetsu Minzoku.
The idea of Japan as a uniquely homogeneous nation.
Exactly. From this perspective, immigration was viewed as an existential challenge to this defining unique element of Japanese identity. The argument was, and still is for many, that accepting foreigners means accepting the eventual erosion of the cultural soul of the nation.
A very deep-seated fear. What was the second frame?
The second, the growth economic frame, was probably the most influential overall, but it was still marked by internal disputes.
How so? You'd think business would be united on needing labor.
Not entirely. Proponents, particularly the powerful business lobby Kaidanren, insisted migration was necessary for growth and to combat severe labor shortages. But opponents, including labor unions and some conservative elements, feared that lower qualified migration would depress wages, undermine the social contract of shared corporate growth, and harm lower qualified Japanese workers.
So a conflict between the big picture economic benefits and the potential local social costs.
Precisely. It created a real tension.
Okay, frame number 3.
Frame 3 was security. Pretty straightforward. Concerns over public order, criminality, and the perceived loss of control over who was coming into the country. These fears often flared up during periods of rising irregular migration.
Understandable concerns, even if sometimes exaggerated. And the final frame?
Finally, the fourth frame was foreign policy and international prestige. Japan desires a leading global role. It wants to be seen as a mature, responsible international actor.
Like signing refugee conventions.
Exactly. That desire drove its accession to agreements like the Refugee Convention. But this aspiration frequently clashed with its restrictive, domestic, containment-based policies. It created a contradiction.
So you have identity, economics, security, and global image all pulling in different directions. It's a perfect recipe for policy paralysis, isn't it?
Absolutely. For decades.
So what finally shattered that deadlock? What led to the 2018 change?
It seems it was sheer pragmatic necessity. A window of opportunity was forced open by undeniable reality. The 2018 reform is rightly dubbed the dam break by analysts because the drivers just became overwhelming.
What were they specifically?
Continuous demographic decline. Japan's population actually started shrinking back in 2008. Severe labor shortages that really started accelerating after 2014. And persistent pressure from major business interests, yes, but also from dissatisfied rural communities who felt left behind by Abenomics and were desperate for workers.
So economic and demographic reality ultimately just overwhelmed the cultural identity and security fears that had prevailed for so long.
It did, but crucially, it required centralized political muscle to push it through. The institutional shift, the centralization of decision-making power in the core executive under Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was vital.
Abe wasn't necessarily a migration enthusiast, though, was he?
Not at all. He and his inner circle were described as reluctant policy entrepreneurs. Sources suggest Abe pushed the reform through despite his personal conservative inclinations, reportedly saying, "I have no other choice, shikara ga nai."
Shikara ga nai, it can't be helped.
Exactly. That statement perfectly encapsulates the tension. The policy was born not of aspiration, but of political survival and economic despair.
And that institutional centralization allowed them to enact what's been called the most significant change in Japan's post-war migration history. What did the 2018 reform actually do?
It finally opened a clear front door for lower qualified foreign workers, ending the reliance on those messy, unofficial side doors. It created 2 new visa categories specifically for these workers and established the Immigration Services Agency, ISA, to manage things.
But they had to manage the politics carefully, right? The identity fears didn't just disappear.
Absolutely not. To achieve this politically, they had to manage those fears very consciously. They reframed the entire debate. This was critical. They stopped using the politically charged term simple workers, Tanjun Rujisha. That was a specific demand from the LDP's more conservative factions.
And replace it with what?
They popularized the highly positive instrumental term foreign human resources, Kaikoku Jinzai. Sounds much better, doesn't it?
Human resources. Very neutral, very economic.
Exactly. It was a deliberate, discursive effort to align migration purely with the growth frame and try to bypass or at least weaken the cultural resistance rooted in identity and security fears.
So Japan changed its policy not because its fundamental philosophy about wa and homogeneity changed, but because it absolutely had to for economic survival. And they changed the language to protect the philosophy while bending the rules at the border.
That seems to be a very accurate summary of the situation. Pragmatism forced the change. Rhetoric managed the fallout.
It is truly striking, isn't it, when you step back? Despite the UK's history of colonial migration and EU free movement, and Japan's completely different history of self-isolation, both nations seem to have converged on a very similar policy mechanism today.
It is remarkable. They're both, in a sense, insular states, resisting higher levels of immigration in general, yet both desperate for labor because of aging populations and shrinking workforces.
And that shared constraint, that tension, seems to force a dual approach in migration policy across both these wealthy, aging economies.
That's right. Both nations are laser-focused on attracting highly skilled migrants, HSMs. That's the priority.
The best and brightest.
While simultaneously maintaining a restrictive, often openly hostile approach to what they officially term unskilled migration.
I just want to pause there for a moment. It's important we acknowledge, as the sources do, that both governments officially use that term unskilled, even though it's often inappropriate and frankly disrespectful of the workers filling essential labor shortages in areas like care or agriculture.
Absolutely. The language itself is part of the political strategy, and that language informs the policy tool both countries now favor, the points-based system. PBS.
Right, the PBS. And this is a clear case of policy convergence, you're saying. Japan looked at the UK.
Explicitly, Japan adopted its PBS framework by referencing the UK's equivalent system. It's a direct borrowing in many ways.
And if the motivation is similar, it suggests it's not just about efficient recruitment, is it? It sounds like it's more about politics.
Correct. The PBS is fundamentally a market-driven model in its rhetoric, but it's primarily designed to sell migration to a domestic public that is broadly skeptical or even hostile to increased numbers.
How does it sell it?
By creating a system that supposedly selects only for those who are highly educated, high-earning, self-selecting, and perceived to be easily integrated, the best and the brightest, as you said, by emphasizing the pure economic benefits of this small elite group.
The government's hope to neutralize the identity and security concerns held by the average voter, like that frustrated passenger on the London train, maybe.
Precisely. It frames migration as a controlled, beneficial transaction, not a potentially disruptive social change.
So the PBS acts primarily as a kind of political facade, a tool to manage public anxiety, rather than a precision instrument for economic planning.
It often functions that way, yes. It's excellent political theater, but here is the irony we uncover when we look at the data. Despite this massive political effort and focus, the policies often suffer from striking ineffectiveness.
Ineffective? How so? They seem so targeted.
Well, both countries exhibit frequent, rapid changes in secondary legislation. Not the core laws, perhaps, but the specific rules, the points thresholds, the salary requirements, the eligible occupations list. They change constantly.
Why does that happen?
Because migration remains intensely political. It's a high salience issue. This constant tinkering, driven by political winds rather than stable economic strategy, often prevents the predictable, stable recruitment environment that businesses actually need to attract global talent.
We saw that in the UK, didn't we? The government repeatedly tightened PBS restrictions in the years leading up to the Brexit vote. That must have sent mixed signals.
Exactly. And post-Brexit, extending the PBS framework to EU citizens created massive uncertainty and arguably exacerbated labor shortages in key sectors like hospitality and healthcare. Businesses couldn't plan.
And what about Japan's attempt with its new system? The Specified Skilled Workers, SSW program, launched in 2019, did that fare any better?
Well, it has struggled dramatically to meet its own goals, which really confirms that political necessity doesn't automatically equate to administrative success. The SSW is specifically created to address acute labor shortages in 14 sectors, things like care work, cleaning, food service, construction.
So not exactly high-skilled in the traditional sense.
No, this is where they stretch the bottom tier of the skill category quite significantly, but the program uptake figures are astonishingly low.
How low are we talking?
They are staggering. Take SSW1 for the hotel industry. The government set an initial 5-year target of bringing in 22,000 migrants. In the first year, they only managed to recruit 67 people. 67.
Wow. Why such a failure? Was there no need?
Oh, the need was definitely there, and plenty of willing foreign workers, too. The failure was largely administrative and structural. The program was designed with numerous layers of bureaucratic complexity, high visa costs for applicants, and critically, a lack of necessary support infrastructure like Japanese language training and integration support for the workers once they arrived.
So the rhetoric was strong, but the actual delivery mechanism was
built on sand, essentially. It wasn't designed for practical success on the ground.
This really highlights a core insight of this section, doesn't it? It seems policymakers in both countries are clearly more interested in solving immediate labor shortages than addressing true skills shortages.
That seems to be the case. They need bodies to fill gaps, especially at the lower end of the labor market. But the political climate compels them to define those bodies as skilled, regardless of the actual job type.
So skill isn't really an objective economic category here.
It's revealed to be highly politically and socially constructed. It's context-dependent and fluid, shifting based on what the government thinks the electorate will tolerate. When they desperately need care workers but fear public backlash against unskilled migration, they politically reclassify care work as needing specified skills, or frame it as attracting valuable human resources.
So the term skill is ultimately being used as a rhetorical mechanism, a political tool.
Exactly, a tool to appease a nervous public, masking the fundamental reality that their advanced economies simply cannot function, let alone grow, without the very workers they often officially deem unskilled, or only reluctantly accept under specific, controlled labels.
We've seen how both countries use the concept of skill, rhetorically, politically, to manage public anxiety around identity and the borders of belonging. And that brings us right to the heart of this entire discussion, really. How we even define national identity in the first place. This idea of a civic monoculture itself.
Okay.
It forces us to revisit that really old dichotomy in political science, civic versus ethnic nationalism.
Yes, the classic dichotomy. It's intellectual shorthand for so many people when they think about different kinds of nations.
Where did it originally come from?
It originated with the German historian Friedrich Meinecke back in 1908. He distinguished between the Staatsnation, the state nation, defined primarily by legal membership in the state, citizenship.
Like France or the U.S. typically.
Right. And the culture nation defined more by shared language, history, and culture, perceived ethnicity.
Like Germany or Japan, often cited.
Those are the common examples. But the sources we looked at argue that this intellectual distinction, especially from the 1970s onwards with thinkers like John Plamenatz, acquired this really heavy and frankly unhelpful normative dimension.
Normative, meaning it became judgmental.
Exactly. The distinction became corrupted in a way. Civic nationalism, seen as Western, became the good nationalism, automatically associated with democracy, stability, prosperity. Ethnic nationalism, often labeled Eastern, became the bad nationalism linked instinctively to conflict, chaos, illiberalism.
And once that good-bad label gets stuck,
it allows critical thinking to operate on autopilot. You just categorize a nation and assume you know its political trajectory.
And the central critique we need to unpack here, the one that fundamentally challenges this whole dogma, is the argument that civic nationalism is still ethnic, that the distinction itself is deeply misleading.
That's the core challenge to the traditional view. Let's break down the logic. If we agree that ethnic denotes the use of culture, any shared trait, like language, religion, shared historical customs, values to define and bind a group identity.
Okay, culture as the glue.
Then citizenship itself must be considered an ethnic tool.
How so? Isn't citizenship purely legal, abstract, based on laws, not culture?
Well, is it? Citizenship is a product of human culture. The institution of citizenship, which forms the entire foundation of so-called civic nationalism, didn't just appear magically out of thin air. It emerged in a specific place, the Greek city-states, initially.
Okay, historically specific.
And its contemporary global form and spread were inextricably linked to the conduit of European colonial empires. It's a historical, cultural, and political artifact. It's not some natural, universal phenomenon existing outside of human practice and cultural transmission.
So if citizenship is basically a set of shared rules, expectations, and practices that humans use to form a group identity, just like using a common language or religion, then it's acting as a common cultural denominator.
Yeah, precisely. Therefore, citizenship is just as much ethnic, a cultural common denominator, as language or religion when it's employed as the defining tool for group building. The inevitable logical conclusion, according to this critique,
is that civic nationalism should be considered a subcategory of ethnic nationalism, not something entirely different.
Exactly. The concept of a civic monoculture inherently requires a shared culture of citizenship, shared civic values and norms.
Wow. Okay, that fundamentally reframes the whole comparison we've been running between the UK and Japan, doesn't it?
It really does.
Countries like the US, often held up as the pure civic exemplar, and Japan, the classic ethnic exemplar. They're not two fundamentally different types of nation under this lens.
No, they're merely different mixes of the same fundamental ethno-civic building blocks. Their difference is only a matter of degree, a matter of emphasis, along a continuum of variously combined ethno-civic scenarios.
So the U.S. emphasizes the citizenship culture, Japan emphasizes the historical linguistic culture, but both are using cultural tools to define the we.
And if you look deeper at the history of the U.S., the supposed ultimate civic exemplar, you see the ethnic roots very clearly. Early U.S. naturalization acts, for example, explicitly restricted citizenship to free white persons.
Right, that wasn't very civic in the modern sense.
Not at all. That limitation demonstrates that even the supposedly neutral legal definition of citizenship was once highly racialized and ethnic, proving that the civic foundation was built upon a restrictive cultural and ethnic core to begin with.
That historical context is crucial. But why does dismantling this good civic versus bad ethnic dichotomy matter for policy today? If we drop the idea that civic nationalism is inherently better, what do we gain?
We gain critical predictive accuracy, for one. The belief that good civic nationalism automatically predicts democracy, stability, and prosperity is simply contradicted by global reality. We stop letting our critical analysis go on autopilot based on these labels.
Can you give some examples of where that formula fails, where civic doesn't equal good outcome?
Certainly. Look at governance track records. Nigeria or Mexico are classic civic nation states. Their identity is defined by legal territory and citizenship, not a single dominant ethnicity, yet they are hardly paragons of democracy, stability, or effective governance, are they? Their civic framework hasn't automatically translated into predictable success.
Okay. And conversely, nations often categorized as ethnic can actually demonstrate high levels of stability and democracy.
Exactly. Countries like Sweden or the Czech Republic are commonly described as ethnic nation-states. Their national identity is heavily tied to shared history and specific cultural lineages, yet they consistently excel at democracy and overall governance metrics.
So the label doesn't predict the outcome.
And furthermore, if you look purely at economic success, the dichotomy fails again. The world's two largest economies today are the U.S. and China. They represent the theoretical, civic, and ethnic models, respectively. It proves there is simply no correlation between this identity framework label and economic dominance.
So the stability and success of a state isn't really determined by whether it calls itself civic or ethnic. Stability, prosperity, democracy, these things depend on a much wider array of factors.
And chief among them, it seems, is the strength and clarity of that civic monoculture, the required cultural common denominator, that shared public script, regardless of whether its roots are primarily in shared law and institutions or shared history and language.
So whether that monoculture is rooted in the deep cultural harmony of wa, like in Japan, or in a secular, shared commitment to public neutrality, like the one demanded by those Birmingham Library campaigners in the UK.
All nation-states, especially diverse ones, share the common challenge. They have to find and perhaps enforce a common script robust enough to maintain unity and allow cooperation, especially as diversity deepens. Hashtag outro.
So, as we conclude this comparison, the core tension really is crystal clear, isn't it? Both Japan and the UK, coming from radically different historical approaches, one prioritizing cohesion through containment, the other prioritizing pluralism through liberal policy, now find themselves facing remarkably similar dilemmas. Yeah, it's striking how similar the problems look now. They both have to negotiate how to preserve some necessary core identity in the face of these relentless demographic and cultural changes.
We've seen Japan reluctantly shift from containment to proactive immigration, driven almost solely by economic necessity and demographic despair.
And forced to use discursive tools like reframing workers as human resources just to appease the deep-seated identity concerns of its public.
While on the other hand, we've observed the UK grappling with the perhaps inherent limits of a liberal pluralism that successfully protected difference but seemingly failed to foster, let alone enforce, coherence.
Leading to that fragmentation and political backlash we saw manifested so clearly in the Brexit debate.
And both nations are now relying on these politically charged instruments like the points-based system,
which we identified as a kind of market-driven framework designed more to manage public anxiety and political messaging than maybe to ensure effective labor recruitment on the ground.
It functions heavily as political signaling, yes.
Ultimately, when you think about it, the difference between the man who runs out of the Tokyo office to take a private call, respecting the group harmony,
and the man on the London train blasting a football match, oblivious to those around him.
It really boils down to that fundamental shared civic script, that civic monoculture. It isn't necessarily about deep cultural likeness in all aspects of life, is it? It's about agreement on public conduct, on how we share space.
Precisely. It's about that shared understanding of public rules and mutual obligations. So if the ultimate test of state survival in the 21st century is maintaining cohesion amidst ever-increasing complexity and diversity, then the question for every diverse society becomes quite stark. It's not merely about whether diversity exists or even celebrating it. It's about how much common ground, how much of that core moral and behavioral vocabulary, that civic monoculture of society, is ultimately willing to enforce, or at least demand, as an unbreakable precondition for full belonging and effective mutual cooperation. That seems to be the uncomfortable question both Japan and the UK, in their very different ways, are now being forced to confront.